Well, good morning, everyone. I hope you've all had your coffee after that cocktail reception last night. I want to introduce our excellent panelists who are going to help us walk through the issues around energy security, renewable energy. We have over here Christof Rühl, who comes from the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. On the end, McLeod, who is the Global Head of Price Risk Management at Hartree Partners. And in the middle, we have Gauri Jauhar, who's from S&P Global, based here in Delhi. So on this issue, I mean, we've talked a lot about this already, those of you who were in the panels yesterday. I was at the very first IATA World Sustainability Symposium, which was about 1.5 years ago. And back then, the talk was sort of optimistic. I mean, there was some realism, but it was optimistic around the net zero target. We were only about 1.5 years since it had been put in place. Now, I think things have shifted somewhat. So I want to come to Christof, first of all, to talk to us about this change in the narrative around the net zero 2050 target. Well, what's going on? What's the situation?
Yeah, so good morning, everyone. First, I think it's visible, it's audible, and everybody knows it. There's a big move away from enthusiasm for the energy transition, concerns that it doesn't go far away, but fast enough, but the belief that it's manageable and all of that, towards a state of affairs where it's almost, it's weird for people like me who have always been known for saying not so fast and it's more difficult than you think. Now suddenly we are on the other side of the fence almost saying don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Maybe there is a climate issue we need to tackle. And for the discussion, so I think there's 3 areas where I would single out this change as most visible. The first, and probably by far the most significant, is there's a shift in the narrative. The world used to be simple. It was like scientists tell us we have a climate problem. It comes from the emissions of greenhouse gases. The majority, more than 60% of greenhouse gases are caused by combustible fossil fuels, oil, coal, gas. Therefore, what we need to do is to substitute. We need to throw away the old fossil fuels and replace them with clean, renewable energy, with a narrative of substitution, which was always kind of naive, but most of people really went for it. And now what we are seeing is that this is being replaced, and this is already well underway, by a narrative of complementarity. So people realize that you need to combine all fuels, that you need to take a holistic view of the energy sector. For example, as long as you can show that the introduction of a new dirty power plant somewhere can help to increase the share of wind and solar because it addresses the intermittency problem in a particular electricity grid. As long as that's the case, it makes sense to focus on the goal, which is emission reductions, and not on the ideology of which fuels should we use. The title here says it, one example where this comes from, energy security. I mean, after 22, the invasion in Ukraine, in particular in Europe, so to speak, the heartland of supporting the energy transition, it became obvious to what an extent fossil fuels were really capable of mitigating these shocks and carrying and sustaining energy security, and to what an extent intermittent renewables just couldn't do that job. I remember being sort of, shall we say, heavily attacked on Twitter before the Ukrainian invasion for saying that there will be no energy transition without energy security, and there cannot be energy security without fossil fuels. Now you say a sentence like this and everybody shrugs. That's how it has changed. What does that mean, sort of zeroing in on the energy, on the airline and aviation industry? Clearly, one example for complementarities we look at is the hybrid car, which combines both new and old. And another one sort of is when you have biofuels in the fuel mix. I think it means, and we have to discuss that aviation fuel requirements to clean them up and so falling under the category of what is still deemed acceptable as complementarity and will not go away. So as the winds continue to change and people become more skeptical of the energy transition, I think fuel requirements will be a bastion which will last longer or will be sustained longer. The second big topic is the question of targets. Thousands, or maybe much more correct, 10,000s of companies have given themselves net zero targets. Industries have done so. Governments, more than 100 governments in the world have given themselves net zero targets, usually between 2030 and 2050. And it becomes obvious that they will not be kept.
And some of them are talking openly about it.
And the very top of it sits the Paris Agreement. And take it from an economist, when I look at the numbers, there is no way that we reach 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius short of a major economic collapse. Now, the International Panel for Climate Change will have to make that public. People working, companies, people making decisions will also ask themselves already, what do we do? And then you have two scenarios. What do people do when they're disappointed, when they've been told for decades, this can be done, this is easy, let's go for it. And then they're told, sorry guys, it doesn't work, wasn't so. They may either become more cynical, and you see it in election results all over the globe, people don't want to deal with the topic anymore, or they will look out of the window, the climate continues to behave strangely, and they think now we need to double down. What does this mean for the aviation industry? Again, it's sort of at the epicenter of that, because one of the issues is when you have missed targets, people will think about fresh solutions. An obvious solution, or an obvious way to address the problem, which hasn't really been tried, is to supplement carbon prices with a global market for offset, a real market solution. And CORSIA, of course, is the first industry-led experiment in that, and all the problems with it are sort of epitomized, will be faced by others. That's why that, I think, is a second issue we should discuss.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that.
And the last point, just very briefly, is globally, renewables are about 7.58% of primary energy. And in the aviation industry, renewable fuels is much, much less, 0. Whatever. So it pays to look at the fossil component of the energy system and not lose sight of that as we did the last few years. We are entering most likely a period of peak or plateau oil production with all sorts of related pressures on oil prices in the long term, which will make that transition much more difficult, and even more difficult for industries which rely heavily on hydrocarbons like the aviation industry. And that, I think, is a third point to keep in mind, so don't lose track of what happens in the bigger part of the energy world, which is still fossil.
Yeah, you can't separate the two. Gauri, here in India, there was never any talk of 2050.
Yes.
And now, I guess, in hindsight, the 2070 target that was set by India in Glasgow 4 or so years ago is looking somewhat prescient. I mean, what is your view, and certainly from this region, of that narrative?
Sure. So I think when India came out with the 2017 net zero target in Glasgow, there were a lot of raised eyebrows and why 2070? And I think there was an underlying sense of balance in that target, that and realism, that a country where 70% of the grid generates on the basis of coal, where biomass is still very important, had been important. The energy transition, one of the things we believe in S&P Global is that the energy transition has a multi-dimensional view. So it's multiple fuels, multiple pathways, multi-speed, and it will look different in different regions. So for instance, if you look at a lot of the targets in Asia, you have targets 2060, 2065, India's 2070. So it was never real for Asia, large parts of Asia, India, China, Indonesia, to think even of a 2050 target. If you look at Africa, for instance, I mean, we did some work in Africa, and I think one of the things which came out of the African Union was we need to carbonize before we decarbonize. And one of the things I always go back to, which sort of grounds the view of the energy transition in India is, I mean, there's a lot of targets, and we are on the way to, having about 50% non-fossil fuel power capacity by 2030. But that said, in India, the energy transition is also a move from biomass to LPG. That is a bigger energy transition which is not talked about as much. So I think that's what I would try to reframe in a multi-dimensional sense.
Rob, let's get into the nitty-gritty here of what this means for the aviation industry. You talk to sort of all different parties along the value chain, including refineries. I mean, is that we see refineries closing with potentially peak oil, potentially oil demand coming down? What does that mean for energy security and in particular for the availability in the future of things like SAF?
Yeah, I think it's a real problem, and it's one that's not really being addressed enough. That we look at the bigger picture and say, okay, we want to get to net zero, we want to decarbonize, and so governments who in decades past would have done everything to keep their refineries open for energy security reasons are now sitting back, happily letting them close. without really looking at the specifics that fossil jet demand is going to continue to grow for decades to come. And the refineries closing, rationalizing, particularly in the West, in the developed world, is going to almost certainly mean that we've at least got challenges for jet fuel supply. And, of course, jet isn't just a civilian use product. It has important military use as well. And it seems shocking to me that in the last 24 hours, we've had the UK government saying we're rearming and preparing ourselves on a war footing, and yet Scotland's only refinery has just shut, with no help from the government to keep it open. I think there are issues, and I think they need to be looked at. And one of the key supports or potential fixes is sustainable aviation fuel. If we can at least see some of the refinery closures actually being repurposed for SAF production, that helps to bridge the gap.
But I think what we heard yesterday, and has become apparent, obviously, as we see the numbers for SAF not meeting expectations, is that the ultimate determinant of that is price, right? The airlines have such small margins, they simply cannot afford to buy SAF. Christof, what's your view? Do you think that the horse is already bolted, that the mandate's been put in too early, and now we're sort of picking up the pieces of that? What do you think the airlines should do when it comes to SAF?
I mean, this price disparity, that's for real, and it is a problem. But it is also just one aspect of a bigger issue, which is that there will just, in the foreseeable future, there is no way for generating enough supplies to have really truly sustainable aviation fuel. I happen to be from Germany. When I come home and fly somewhere and then drive, I see giant maize fields everywhere, cornfields, and I know what kind of water they use and what kind of monoculture they create, and I know that this is maybe a bigger problem than the 0-point-something carbon emissions which are eliminated by mixing biofuels. That is a problem which we had experienced already with biofuel mandates, in particular in the US. And you can then gradually see how the production of biofuels moved into countries which are more susceptible, shall I say, to financial incentives or political pressure in palm oil fields and so on. And I think there will be, given by technology, a hard constraint of how much we can really solve by fuel mixing. And this is one of the reasons why, since the narrative has changed, I emphasize so much the emergence of these offset markets, something which most people don't want to hear about it anymore because it's so complicated, has never really succeeded and so on. And I think in the long term there will be no other choice. So we have to learn how we make them work, how we make them work as markets. And the problem is we engage in all sorts of mental knots by trying to figure out how to price something which people are not supposed to do. Don't chop down this piece of rainforest and you get so and so many units to pay. And so I think the problem, of course, here is not one of accounting, whether it can be doubled up with NDCs or not. It is a genuine problem. How do you price, how do you make environmental things an asset which an income stream, as we know it from other industries? How do you get to a point where you say, okay, however this piece of rainforest as an example, wherever it comes from, whether you create it or not, as long as it's there, we can calculate how much it acts as a carbon sink, you get X amount for money for it, and if it's gone, you don't get that money anymore. A simple, robust scheme like that, rather than the over-regulation. And biofuels is just at the end of the regulatory chain.
I mean, surely that would come with significant regulatory issues to set up a market like that, and time, which again.
The regulation has to go. I mean, has to be severely limited. A market is a market because it's driven by economic interests and people acting that way. A regulator, of course, we all know that will never be able to judge whether sort of a producer really produces what he promises to produce. I give you another example. So a swamp or a piece of rainforest is one, where we have to learn to just treat it as an asset, measure what it generates in benefits, pay for it. The bigger picture, of course, it has to be linked to a carbon price. These two markets have to be linked. None of them can work really in isolation. For example, take somebody who says, I switch tomorrow, I will no longer produce plastic bags, I will make them out of some recyclable material. You as a regulator, you have no chance of knowing whether the guy would have done this anyway, whether he does it out of the goodness of his heart, whether he really saves as much carbon, greenhouse gas emissions as he promises. But if there would be a carbon price, then you could just tell this person, okay, fine, you don't get anything from me, don't even tell me. You get carbon credits which you can trade, and the market for offsets is somewhere else, because this guy, by using other inputs, doesn't have to pay the price for carbon, so his bags get cheaper. We don't need to worry to pay him offset fees and all of that. You cannot do one or the other, and therefore, here you have also the reason why we have failed so far. It's just so hard to do it politically.
Rob, you've spoken to me about something like this. Do you agree that there needs to be a market mechanism to incentivize renewables?
Absolutely. I mean, I completely agree with Christof's suggestion of all the challenges around sort of valuing carbon offsets and all of the difficulties in regulating them. What we've seen already in other regions and with other fuels is that some things are a bit simpler. Biofuels blending credits, as an example, work. We've seen them work, particularly the low carbon fuel standard in California has been clearly the most successful project in the world for incentivizing the uptake of renewable fuels. And something similar, a SAF blending credit, potentially a global one or specifically, say, an EU one, in order to support mandates, would clearly work significantly better than, with the greatest respect to anyone from the European Commission, the current Refuel EU, which I think every airline here would probably agree has been terribly implemented. If airlines were the ones mandated, and they had their 2% mandate in the EU going up to 6%, and they could potentially blend more, receive credits, and bank them for the future. It would smooth the demand profile, which would make it easier for oil companies and producers to invest. It would also help to clarify the value of it. You wouldn't have this huge mismatch that we see now between what the biofuels producers are getting for the product and what airlines are being charged for the product, which is, I think, one of the biggest issues in SAF right now. And yeah, the whole system would likely work better, and it would work better for financing the growth in production as well.
Gauri, here in Asia, are they looking at the mistakes that possibly, if we can call them mistakes, I don't know, depends who you ask. Are they looking at the policies and how they're playing out in places like Europe and learning from that? What is the policy stance in this region on SAF at this point?
Sure, I think there's a lot of variability in here in terms of targets. And I think there was a very powerful statistic shared by Preeti from IATA yesterday about the 0.7% is really the number for SAF right now globally. And I think that reality is not lost in Asia. We have targets, ranging from 1% for 2027 for a few countries like India, Indonesia, South Korea, 1% in 2026 for Thailand and some other countries, and also going up to almost 47% in 2050 for countries like Malaysia. So I think a lot of these sound more aspirational targets, I would say. One or two things which I found interesting was in Japan, there's a lot more focus on research to look at, Boeing has a facility on research and technology to focus on algae-based biofuels. There's also a subsidy of about, it's a small amount, but nonetheless a subsidy on industrial and general waste, how waste could be converted into SAF. So I think it's important to see that there are a lot of multiple solutions. I think one of my favorite lenses on SAF, but also other renewable technologies, is that 70% of the technologies which are required for a net zero future, whether it's 2050 or 2070, are not commercial yet.
Yeah.
And that is why I think it's very important to track the technology readiness levels, what's the TRL 2 or 3 or 4 or 7 and 9, and what's that path to the TRL, the higher TRLs. And I think that's a work in progress, and we're seeing, new commercial thresholds being crossed, for instance, in battery storage right now. We are seeing new commercial thresholds coming out in like the sodium-ion batteries. So I think it's important to view all these technologies far more holistically.
I think I would even go one step further and say it's not that the targets have been overly ambitious. In many cases, the targets are the problem. It's not the right way to do it, this kind of central planning. You have always a choice. You can try to have a target, which usually is some quantitative volume target, and then check on people that they behave accordingly, and then hope that the investment dollars go in the right R&D to find better technologies. Or you can put a price on the system. You say, okay, you can emit as much as you want, but it's going to cost you so and so much. And then you look at it and you observe, you give out less permits or more permits, depending on how much overall volume you want to generate in this discussion. And it's always, I think from an economist's perspective, so much better to slap a price on it rather than some big administrative apparatus. Here's another example, real-world example. Every year we see energy intensity, so that's the amount of energy you need to generate $1 of global GDP, improve by between 1.5% and 2% year after year after year. This is the sole reason why we have in this exploding growing system over the last 100 years still enough fossil fuels, because it becomes more and more efficient. Over the same period, if you look at carbon intensity, how much carbon has been emitted per unit of energy used, it's stable, it doesn't move. Why is that? Because it's free. If I go out of the house and electricity is expensive, I switch off the light. If electricity is for free, I don't. It's very simple. And we need this kind of simplicity and take away this kind of overcomplicated central plan approach. I'm not saying this because I'm opposed to the energy transition. I'm saying that because I'm convinced that it would accelerate.
Well,
and I think, to Christof's point, I think the importance of markets is very critical. In fact, Christof, in a former life, we used to work together. And I still remember Christof saying, markets work if you let them. Remember in the statistical review, you had said that, right?
I don't know.
Famous last words.
Never.
And I think the let them part is important because, we are in a region, also in a country where most of the energy sector is government-owned, government-regulated, government-run. So there are markets, but I think these are not complete markets. So the full price discovery mechanism doesn't happen in market after market after market. So I think that is a reality which one has to contend with.
And I was struck yesterday listening to Peter Elbers from Indigo talk about his considerations around SAF, that he simply, it's not produced here in India, and so what's he going to do? Put it on a tanker and ship it halfway around the world? That then completely negates the
point of it.
The whole point of it, doesn't it? It adds to the carbon footprint. So, is there an opportunity for India? I know India is, for example, the third largest ethanol producer in the world. Are there opportunities in this region to sort of take the lead on SAF production, renewables, biofuels?
So I think India geographically and has a multiple feedstock options which, if fully explored, could lead to India. And I think there was a big statement made by Boeing at the CII Business Summit last week as well on that, the potential of India to supply about 8 to 10 million metric tons. But I think these are all, it requires again a very ecosystem approach to make sure the feedstock and the matching of the producers and the offtake does happen. So I think these are great possibilities, but I wouldn't still see a clear pathway to them.
Rob, time is ticking along, and we have not yet discussed the fact that oil prices are 21% below their peak in January. We're seeing a sort of double disincentive right now for SAF in particular. Renewables is the drop in the oil price, and obviously the shift in the narrative, especially sort of led by the Trump administration. How is that impact? You speak to everyone along the value chain. How's that impacting?
Yeah, I think, you're completely right. Lower fossil fuel prices effectively make renewables seem more expensive in comparison. But to flip it on its head, all the airlines in the room are saving so much money on their fossil jet. You've maybe got a bit more in your budget to be able to invest more in SAF. So there are positives and there are negatives, but I think in the short term we've probably got more downside for prices, and that's obviously great for the industry, but of course the reason it's not so great is because it's coming from the threat of an economic downturn and concerns about that.
I mean, so that people understand the mechanics, there might be something in the works which is longer-term consequential, not just this short-term OPEC problem. And that is if we have peak oil demand plateauing. The oil market is a market which has only grown since it exists. When this market, or any market for that matter, starts to shrink, then if you're a producer in that market and you want to sell whatever it is, oil, if you only try to keep the same volume sales as before, you have to, by definition in a shrinking market, gain market share. How do you do that? You compete with the same product, oil. You compete against your other producers on price. And so there is the realistic possibility. Analysts are only divided basically whether it peaks after 2030 or within that decade. Only OPEC says it will not peak before 2040. Everybody else says it's in the numbers. And then there is a possibility that we get, like in the 80s, a sustainable period of very low oil prices. I agree with Rob. This is not the end of the world. This needs something which can be dealt with, again, easier with flexible prices for renewables than with government interference. But it's certainly something which will change the world, give us a little breathing space in terms of other costs, which then will, of course, come. The European Union already has a border tax for carbon-intensive products. Saudi Arabia already is thinking, why don't we do the same, tax our own oil production, then we don't need to pay the European tax because we tax it already, but we keep the revenues instead of the European. So we should expect more like that, and that's of course not very effective in solving the fundamental problem. And again, it's something to think ahead of, and it's something which speaks greatly in trying to globalize markets to address this problem, rather than running behind and always being late as government regulators.
Well, I mean, I think the risk, if, as you're saying, we're heading into a period of possibly sustained low oil prices, is that everyone waits until it starts raining to fix the roof, that people sort of sit back on their laurels, let fossil fuel production go up. What should the aviation industry in particular be doing to plan ahead? Rob,
Well, I was just going to jump in and say, I mean, the thought that necessarily passing peak demand is going to mean we see sustainably lower prices isn't necessarily, or shouldn't be really, a given. Because without investment, conventional oil production declines at 4 to 6% per year. I don't think there's anyone, even the most optimistic about decarbonisation, that thinks that demand is going to decline so quickly. So if we're not going to continue to invest in fossil fuels, we'll actually lead to an undersupply, because we'll see supply dropping faster than demand is dropping. So that means that the markets are going to need to continue to price to actually incentivize ongoing infill drilling and enhanced oil recovery and everything to keep production as high as we need it to meet the still existing demand.
Gauri, you wanted to chime in there?
Yeah, I think this whole idea about the peak demand. When you go back to 2003, when China's demand came and the world was surprised, right? I think we're seeing regions now of the world, including India, where there is a real effort, I think, on the part of several analysts, including ourselves, to really understand India's demand better. And I think some of our early learnings are that there could be a big missing data problem here. India, in many markets, including telecom, has seen quantum leaps in demand. If you look at all of Africa, I mean, there's a lot of underestimated demand, latent demand. And so I think demand is something. If you look at India, for instance, again, there's a whole medium and small scale enterprises which comprise about 30% of the workforce. It has a huge economic impacts. And that demand is still not fully captured in the economic numbers. So to link it back to energy demand, I think it will be difficult to say we may be close to peaking, at least in India, and big parts of at least non-OECD Asia and Africa.
Yeah. Christof?
I think, to be clear, there's two issues which we must keep apart. One is, will oil demand peak? And the other one is, if it peaks, will it pressure down prices durably. Yeah. Will it peak? I belong to those who do this. But when you look at the last 30 years in oil demand, oil intensity, again, the amount of oil you need for $1 of global GDP improves 2% every single year. This has happened for 30 odd years. If you're willing to continue that without even discussing EVs and so for another 5 years, then we would have peak demand or peak plateau. Right. And this is a global market, so it really doesn't matter whether it still grows in India or in Africa or some, which it will. Europe uses less oil now than it did in the 1970s. Right. The OECD has peaked in the 80s, so there's only very few growth centers left. So that's one problem, if it peaks or plateaus. Now, if that happens, then I disagree with Rob, because if that happens, investment will still be forthcoming. It will just meander to the cheap production areas. And we are seeing this. Why in this short-term problem you described is Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE all investing and expanding their capacity because they're getting ready for a race to the bottom. That there is price competition doesn't mean there is no investment. It just means the more expensive producers are get weeded out first. And the second issue, which will happen if it really peaks, the pressure on OPEC, the cartel which has held prices up successfully for so long, will be unbearable. We see the first cracks now in OPEC Plus, and that in a shrinking market will just, there's no space for a cartel to keep prices up because they would be undercut left, right, and center. So I don't think it will be a dramatic peak, so more in line with what you said, it will be more a plateau, but the forces will be towards durable price declines if it peaks.
We have just a couple of minutes left. Obviously, one area where we're not going to see demand peak anytime soon is in the aviation industry. It's growing. We see that the need for fuel is going up and up. So, I mean, what is your, maybe we'll go around, what do you think needs to be done now? Where does this industry need to channel its efforts in order to secure supply, given that we're now in a situation where we're not just talking about whether or not there's going to be enough SAF, but whether or not there's going to be enough jet fuel and if the economics will work? Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, I think we need to focus on both fossil jet supply and SAF supply. I think we need to look closely at where refineries are already closing and where they might in the future. And that's both a regional issue. Say Europe has been seeing increased imports for a number of years now, and lengthening supply chains exposes us to more risk, more supply challenges. But also then we need to look at the micro issues of there are certain airports that are maybe inland airports with almost all of their fuel supply coming from one refinery. If or when that refinery shuts down, there's going to be a local supply issue as well. So it's a regional issue, it's a local issue.
Gauri, what's your view?
I think I would, again, go back to the ecosystem approach that, all the players need to be discussing with each other in terms of, how to tie up the ends of the market. I think Christof's point on price mechanisms is the best way. I mean, markets work if there's a proper price. So in looking at all the options, whether it's the offset markets or the interactions between the off-takers and the producers, I think it all has to work with an ecosystem approach.
Final word for you, Christof.
I think this reliance on targets, on volume targets, has done no good politically, commercially, and also for industry associations. So I think sooner or later this will happen automatically, that especially industry associations will go the way of saying, give us reliable price signals and leave it to us, which ones of the flowers blows. Are we getting more efficient? Are we having success with mixing other biofuels into the mix? And so on, leave that to us. And one last, so by way of example, you look at a country like the UK, what sort of chaos the current target policy, a prime example of setting targets all the time and then running behind them. So, not enough natural gas anymore, probably very expensive nuclear industry with price target, and at the same time this reforestation in Scotland left to a few individuals who try to. If you had a price target there, then somebody like the aviation industry could go and plant a piece of forest in Scotland, as other people already do, just on a scale which is valuable, and say now we get the units for it, the unit credit for it, and that solves part of our problem. That's how it should be done. But government bureaucrats will never come up with that in advance. That has to be left to the spirit of entrepreneurs, and that's where the train is going, I hope.
So a shift in policy. Thank you, everyone, very much. I think we have to end it there and hand over to the next panel from my colleague, Richard Quest. Thank you very much.